Alright, it's time to get some more 4coder stuff done. I'm going to just jump right in here. So next we want to look at the footer panel. And the truth is it's going to be a little bit messy. This is code from a long time ago that hasn't been touched in a long time because I didn't want it to break. And today we are breaking it apart and putting it back together better than it was before. So we're going to be looking at some pretty weird stuff, I suspect. So this right here, this is the primary thing we have to look at. So special note view ID gives me the ID of a view which is being used for special notes, which basically means the footer panels. Okay. So the interesting things that have to happen are, first of all, I want to figure out what the command is that fails to skip that. I feel like it's this one. No. Okay. Then perhaps it's, no. Come on. There it is. Alt 2. Why does that happen? Let's go to base commands. Let me go to MetaGen real quick to look up to open matching file CPP, get view next looped. And then if I go over to the framework, get view next looped. Alright, so I want to do this as looped get next view looped all panels. The first step to any of these things is making the naming scheme more explicit so I can remember what they all mean. Then I want to do get next view what did I say? James is suggesting I must have said something different than what I meant, or maybe I said it in a confusing way. Yes, what I mean to say is I'm looking for better names for these things so that I don't need to remember them. I guess what I'm thinking, yeah, that's an interesting point. Because what I said was so that I can remember them. But it's more like so that I don't have to remember them, because then the name explains it better for me. Yeah, I feel like it's more like offloading the mental work of remembering in so that like I have to do less mental work to remember than I used to. So from one point of view, it means that the computer is doing the memorizing for me. From another point of view, it's easier to remember. I think we're on the same page. Get next view looped primary views or primary panels. There we go. So that fixes the bug that I've had for a long time where that was using the wrong get next view. Interesting. I guess that should actually be taking an access flag, shouldn't it? Okay, so that fixes the naming problem. Now let's come back here and look at how we think about these other operations. So there's how I get next and previous, which is basically just a matter of do the low-level version to get the next or previous, and then check and see if I'm on a special note. If I am, then just continue. If I'm not, then take this panel. Okay, this is unrelated to this. Okay. Close special node view, open special node view. So the problem is this here basically assumes that there is only one, which isn't really going to work. So what happens if I just say these are gone? How much stuff breaks? Not too much. Alright. So we need to be able to answer the question how we open the special note view for things like opening the build panel. Close the build panel. Why isn't that using get or open build panel? I feel like this is just the way that should have been written all along. Okay, so here's a question. Why doesn't this right here use the get comp buffer macro? Alright, so trying again. Okay, so what I really want to be able to do here is I guess a part of this that I don't fully understand is what the API will look like when we're done. So I need to ask myself what that's going to be first and like consider it. So yeah, the question is, what API do I actually want here? Because this isn't quite right. It's not just a matter of taking these and rewriting them over here or something, because when I generalize this, this won't be possible anymore. There won't just be a single special note that I can refer to. I need another way to refer to that. And so these commands here right now, what they're specifically for is dealing with the build panel, not just all footer panels. They're meant for the build panel. So if I keep the idea that the behavior will be the same at the end for these commands, then what they're actually doing is they're using a specific footer panel, not just any old footer panel, but a specific one that's been set up for building, which means that I have the idea that any panel can be a footer panel when we open it. We open it as a footer panel by putting it in the bottom, like with this sort of ratio of being much smaller here, and then we mark it as a footer so that we don't skip to it when we're going back and forth between primary panels. And once we've created it, we want the ability to ask for the footer panel that we're looking for, which suggests to me that what we're really talking about is something like this, maybe? So it would look like that, and that. So some thoughts. One, we're basically saying that the user will name the panel when they open it, and then from then on, when they refer to the panel, whenever they refer to a footer panel by that name, as long as it's open, they get the same one back. And so if they then later open another footer panel but it has a different name, that would actually trigger the opening of the footer. So what these names are pretty much doing is they're giving us a unique way to refer to each one of these. The reason I'm thinking of it as a string right now is just because if it's a string, it makes it very easy to create a unique identifier without having to like do some kind of brokering of enums, like figuring out what values are already taken and what values aren't taken. You just use a new string, and the string is the name that you're typing in as the code, and it's also makes it unique. As long as the name is unique, so is the identifier. Whereas if I try to do these as integers, for instance, then everybody's got to look up and see what integers are already being used, and then they can make some enum that names the name that they want and binds it to the integer that they want. But that's more work. That can somewhat be automated by the compiler, but not in a way that's very nice or easy. The disadvantage, of course, is now we have to read these strings and do string comparisons and store strings rather than just having nice, clean integers. If I limit the length of the strings to, say, 16 characters, then it could just be a nice, clean memcompare type thing. We'd basically be just saying that we're using 16-byte integers, and that after the null terminator, it's assumed all the other characters in your identifier are zeros. I feel like that works out pretty well. If you put in a string that's longer than 16 characters, we would just provide a warning and truncate to 16 characters. Okay. Now, what is the advantage here? I mean, once we have that working, what will happen if, say, I do this, which is a command that brings up my build footer, and then I do, I don't know, I have some other command that I hit that's also supposed to bring up a footer. Would I be okay with it bringing up a footer right here, or would I want it to have the smarts to always put the footers, like, there and there? I'm not sure. And if it does have that smarts, how does it... I'm not so sure about this, yeah. If it has the smarts to do one there and one there, what happens when I get a third one? How does that handle situations where there are primary panels of different configurations? What if I have a primary panel like this? What if I only have the one primary panel across the whole screen? Does it split the one that exists? Does it come down here and go like that to make more footers? So maybe what I want here is not a generalized thing that goes this far, actually. Maybe I'm actually okay with it not being generalized at this level and keeping an API that's basically structured like this, as we will have to get rid of the idea that this is a special note, and we're going to make it possible to mark a panel as like passive. So there's primary panels and passive panels, and that way if you want to create your own panels that have like other behaviors besides the build panel, that's totally possible and very easy to do in a way that meshes with the primary thing that we actually care about, which is cycling only through primary panels. But it doesn't have to like do all the layout magic itself. I'll leave it for now a question mark how these layouts happen so that people can customize it for themselves, and maybe someday if I have a better answer we will go farther in this direction. So that just leaves renaming some of these things. So this is close build footer panel. And then this is going to be open build footer panel. And then build footer panel view ID. Okay, so the only thing this leaves unanswered is this whole thing here. We have the build footer panel view ID, but that's not quite right. Basically, we want to be able to say close view. We want to be able to say that more than one panel can be passive. And so now I'm questioning what the best way to do that would be. It's a little bit tricky. It's a little bit tricky because there's a question about how we link up a panel to settings. So I have this right here. Alright, so this never does anything to clear itself because it just always gets cleared on every command. So it doesn't have like a lifetime, it doesn't have a concept of its lifetime with a particular panel, right? And the reason I'm thinking about this is these view IDs here, they're not necessarily consistent. Like, if I do this and then this, it's not necessarily the case that the view I have now has the same idea I had at the beginning of this whole thing. Furthermore, if I do this, now I have a panel, like maybe panel 1 and panel 2 are both non-passive and panel 3 is passive. And then if I close that and do this, now maybe panel 3 isn't passive, but how does it come about that its settings get cleared is the question. Because if I leave it up to the user to make sure that whenever they have a command that would close one of these panels, they also clear it, that won't necessarily work out. Like, look at this. If I do this, and then instead of using the command, I have a command that directly closes that, but I could also switch to it, like click on it here and then close it normally. That'll go through the same code path that closes all views. And we don't want to prevent that from working. So that has to somehow either clear the set state right there, or whenever a view gets opened, it needs to clear its state and then have its state modified. So basically what I need is the ability to associate a variable associate a variable to a view and then have that variable's lifetime connected to the view's lifetime in a way that is automatic through all code paths, right? How are we going to do that? Interesting. So let me look at my hooks. I'm not sure if I actually have any hooks that could help here. Default start, command caller, exit, view adjust, open file, default file settings, new file, file save, end file, mouse filter, smooth camera step. Yeah, okay, so we have no hooks that are involved in the lifetime of the view. One solution could be to just introduce that. Let me look at this from another angle though. Suppose I'm here in the framework, and I'm going to have these here. Right now, the way all I do is I set this view ID to control what's passive, but we're going to say that this doesn't actually make it passive. That just makes it the build panel ID, like the build footer panel view ID, right? That just helps us remember which one is the build panel. So I'm also going to want to be able to do like a well, nothing on the close, but on the open, if I get a view, summary view, get active view, split bottom, so this makes a new view underneath the current view. New view settings. Here's a question. Okay. Fair enough. So that's interesting. That basically means that I don't have a hook for open view, and yet I want to do these settings whenever I open a view. And it might be the case that now is a good time to talk about an open view hook and a closed view hook. That might be the best thing to do, because that would solve that problem too. But suppose I didn't solve that problem and I just solved this one. The other thing I could do here that I wanted to look at was, suppose I have the call that's like make view passive app view make view passive application links app view summary view, and then I want to make it passive, so it would be something like view set variable app view passive true. So this could be a new thing I do in the API that lets me associate sort of dynamic variables to objects like this. So pros and cons. Pros, I get the nice feature of variables that have lifetimes attached to the views correctly forever. I have the ability to then do things like view get variable app view passive is passive, and this would give me the ability to, at any location in the code, have a sort of localized concept without having to put anything in a global scope anywhere, like I had to do with those view, like what I had to do over here, right? This thing here I could eliminate, as these would just become view variables as well, called like the, I don't know, the paste index, right? The only problem would be then there's no scoping for any of this, so my section of code could use a variable name that conflicts with someone else's name, right? And we get into that kind of thing. Also, we're using strings again, so that somewhere in the core there's this concept of a list of strings that I have to compare this to. Maybe a hash table, but still, you know? If on the other hand, what I could do is, instead of having these in a global scope, it would just be like static int 32t view paste index variable location, something like this, kind of OpenGL style thing, right? So then I would also have is passive I'll call that location, right? And then at the beginning I just have to go to my hook here. I could have a thing that's like view paste index location equals view variable view is passive location equals create view variable, something like that, and then this would become like a 1 and a 2. Not exactly. So Ryan asked, so the problem is that you need both. I don't think I actually am fully explaining the problem correctly. So the problem is that I need variables attached to the lifetime of a particular view, and I just don't have a good way to do that at all. That's the only problem. I mean, I can't, yeah, I don't really have... The only reason it might look like I'm looking at things that have longer lifetimes is because I'm trying to figure out, using variables that have longer lifetimes, how to simulate variables with those fixed lifetimes, because I mean that's just the way you have to do it eventually. Your variables, like, I don't need necessarily something in global scope, but I need some way to be able to bind. It's kind of like I guess you could call it a linking problem. The code that sets a variable and the code that reads a variable need to have something in common that links them together that they don't have in common with other code, so that I can tell when a particular variable is being set, what other part of code is being affected by that variable being set, right? And I don't have any way to do that linking that's good. That's the real problem. If I use strings, then I have to do a bunch of string work on the inside of the core. If I do this method, I think I get a lot of benefits, but you have this weird thing where now you're assuming all views have exactly the same set of variables for all time, and so it's a fixed number of variables basically at the root level of the view. Maybe some of those variables could be arrays if I work on it enough to make it super smart. Although the way I would probably do that is to just make it so that you can set a variable to a pointer, and that pointer would point to a more complex data structure of a variable length, right? But yeah, so the other thing is, once I have decided how, like, one easy way to fix the linking problem is to put it into a global scope like I did with view paste index, right? And that scope, now that it's in global scope, there's this question of how do I link each particular variable to one of the views. And so instead of making it a linking problem of how do I get the code that writes the variable and the code that reads the variable to communicate to each other, which is very easy, they're just both referring to the same global variable, the problem becomes how do I get the code that set this variable on this view to only affect the code that runs for this view. And I do that using the view ID here. But the problem is the view ID isn't actually tied to the lifetime the way it would need to be to make that work. And it only worked for this because it was shorter than a lifetime that this variable needed to work for. That variable only needed to last for one command to the next, and when a view dies and another view with the same ID opens, you could actually discover a bug there. But it's a bug that you wouldn't ever trigger it, because in between the command that would have left the paste index in a particular value and the command that would have tried to trigger that bug, you had to have used another command to close and open a view, right? So there's technically a bug there that you could expose if you did enough work to write the right command to expose it. And yeah, so the problem is if I could, what I would do is I would have it be something like this. I think looking at it, I'm okay with this. This lets me set up like a global system for naming what variables exist that doesn't make me do a lot of string work. Yeah, so don't get too hung up on views and panels. Views and panels are basically the same thing. Basically, the only reason there's a difference is once upon a time a panel could have more than one view and only one of them was active, but it had more of them built in, and the code is collapsed down to the point where they're separate, except that the panels are just used for doing the literal layout work, and the view contains all of the structures for what goes into like doing stuff. So like they're the same thing. For each panel there's one view, and for each view there's one panel. They have a one-to-one relationship to each other. In the core, they exist as separate structures with pointers to each other because they get created and deleted separately. But panels don't have IDs. Everything that actually exists is a view, and the only time I use the word panel is just when it feels right. Conceptually, you can really just think of it as the same thing. Yeah, so I mean, you're not. Yeah, you're not totally wrong. There is some interesting like layers of like, okay, what is the you could in the past there used to be an idea that you had some views that weren't actually being exposed, and that just isn't there anymore. But that is what it used to mean. A long, long time ago, it meant that, and so there's still like little bits of things here and there that imply that, even though that's gone now. It's still true that views are an abstract concept that describe the current state of a buffer as it is being edited. Like there's the buffer that's just the state of the buffer. Then there's the buffer plus a view is a buffer in the process of being edited, and so there's fewer views than buffers. And you can't have multiple views on the same buffer that are both editing it in a different way, right? And then panels are the thing that actually bring a particular view onto the screen. It's just that now that I've simplified a lot of stuff, there's always only one view per panel and one panel per view, so they're kind of synonymous now. But I have to keep weighing this. So the other nice thing about this is this does work for people. If anyone else ever wants to add a variable to their view, they can do this as well. The only problem is that it needs to be something that happens once, unless I use some kind of syncing thing. Because what I could do is say that we actually do give variables names, and so I would be like, alright, create a view variable called the paste index, and create another view variable called the isPassive, right? And the thing is, now the difference is I wouldn't even need to make these global, right? Because what I could do is say both of these go away, and both of these go away, and I create them, and then anytime I want them, I can just do int32 isPassive location, right? And this wouldn't create a new variable. It would first go isPassive and check and go, oh, we already have a variable called that, and so then it would return the integer for that thing. And once you have the isPassive location index, then you could do something like view set variable app view isPassive location true, right? And so this would be the same as setting isPassive to true. Now, for optimization purposes, you probably would move that out to global, but now if you are in a situation where you don't want to edit the start hook for some reason, then you don't have to. You can still create variables on the fly, and if you call it multiple times, nothing will go wrong as long as the names match between the separate calls. So this prevents problems like, oh, I didn't feel like trying to edit the start hook, I just wanted to put this at the top of my command. Like, I have two commands that can do this, and I just wanted to put it at the top of those commands that I create the variable, and then once I have the variable, I can yeah, the other thing I would probably do is just say, let's make sure that these are like this. Actually, I might do it the other way around. I might say, let's make it 64-bit no matter what platform you're on, and then it's up to you to cast it to something else. I think that's what I would do. Right. I like this way. This also means that if two different plugins both want to refer to the same variable name, they could still conflict with each other, but if they actually are doing it for cooperative reasons, they could do that too. So, and I also wouldn't mind doing string manipulation if it's not per view that I have to manipulate all these strings, but I have one data structure that keeps track of the set of variables that are possibly set on all views. The only other interesting things is now that has to be a growable thing, because at any given time a new variable can be declared that wasn't on that view before. And once a new variable is declared on a view, now it will be there forever. So it would basically be like we put it onto the list, we return a new index, and then we have to go to all the other views and grow their sort of user variable space out, which wouldn't be that bad if we just pre-allocate a lot of space. I mean, these are only 64 bits each, so if there's like, you know, enough for 100 of them, and then that gets fully used, we would just double the space and keep going, and we would also only ever have to double the space once one of the higher indexes actually gets used. Okay. We're going to go down this road. And I probably want to put that under initialize. The other thing I'm thinking of is at some point in the future the API might get so deeply reworked that this becomes like a redundant thing that it's actually easier to do these lifetime things in a different way. But this is nice and cooperative, I feel like. This is a nice way to make a cooperative variable thing where maybe 3 or 4 different code bases all want to be able to set up variables. And you know what? The variables don't have to be like this. They can be any string. So you could be like, let's make it a tradition that we always put like a module name. So I could be like, this is default, and then is passive, or something like this, right? So there's my variable name, and all of the variables in the default layer will look like default dots, so that you can easily avoid conflicts if you want to avoid conflicts by using a module name like that. And just then, as long as your module name is unique, you know, everything works fine. And these don't actually need to be simulated modules because they're really just strings that can contain anything. Yeah. Okay. Okay. I feel like that I'm okay with this. And since I feel like this is the kind of thing I've been thinking about for a long time that we are eventually going to need. Doing it on views instead of buffers, because in the past I've thought and talked about doing something like this on buffers. I think doing it on views first is more lightweight because there are fewer views, and there's actually more complex lifetime stuff on views than there are on buffers, since I never added hooks for them and stuff like that. The only thing about this is if I go back to here, I haven't actually solved the thing where I never get the new view settings totally right. Of course, what's interesting is view set setting, it's kind of like a variable that's just built in. A setting is just a built-in variable. And that means maybe someday I deprecate setting and move everything into variables, and then this becomes a matter of default values. Speaking of default values, that sounds like a good idea. So there we go. Create a view variable, is passive, set its default value. And then we would also work on doing the same thing to this. So instead of having view paste index, let's just go ahead and force ourselves to make this work for more than just this, because I'm not really going to be testing the passive stuff very carefully, which means I won't be testing, and the reason I won't be testing it very carefully is just because there's a lot of weird stuff that could be in there that I'm kind of, you know, I'm not going to be leaning on the system for anything other than the build panel, but view paste index will come up more frequently for me. So I'm going to force myself to get this system right by making both of them go through it right away. So view paste index location equals 0. Paste index, and that'll have a default value of 0. Okay, so we need to be able to create new variables, and then if I go down to my nose is just feeling itchy for some reason. It's annoying. Framework. It's like, I don't know. I'm not very good at blowing my nose. Does anyone else feel that way? Like they can't quite get it to work when they blow their nose. My eyes are struggling. I need to close the windows or something because it's just too bright right now. Alright, so let's see. Yeah, so when we want to set a view to passive, all we have to do is go view set variable app special view view is passive location true. I still think I actually probably want to just have a wrapper for this though. And then there's kind of a separate thing which is static void or view summary open view as open footer panel view. Open footer view. I don't know. At some point I should just go and eliminate footer panel, footer view stuff and just make it all views, I think. Like footer view sounds weirder to me than footer panel, even though what I'm actually opening is a view. View summary, return special view, special view equals open footer panel app view application links app view summary view view set passive return special view, and then Rasmus asks, is there a built-in terminal in 4coder? I'm not sure what you mean. You mean like hit a key that sends a message to a terminal and causes a build to happen there? I mean, 4coder has this, so it's running a terminal command and putting the output into a buffer. But that's not the same as running in the terminal, which would be like taking one of these things and running it in there. There's no way to cause 4coder, there's nowhere for 4coder to cause that to happen in this view over here, or in this prompt over here, if that's what you're asking. So yeah, the thing I showed you there where I did that, that's just a project command. You want to go check out the project system to see more about it. But basically, with the project system, you can specify a list of commands, and your commands have names, an output buffer, a couple other features like does it go to a footer or not. Because like I can build my site and it comes actually to the upper. Ooh, there's a problem. Not sure what this is. I'll have to look at that. But oh, I know what that is. Am I doing a dot slash somewhere in there? No. Might be in my build.cpp. Anyways, point is, so that one does not go to the footer because that's my site build, and then if I hit F1, that takes it to a footer panel down here, and then you can see it like for Windows, the command it runs is it echoes build x64, as in here's build x64, and then it runs build.bat, and that's this script here. Alright, so in order to decide whether to skip this, we have to go if not is passive. View get variable app view view is passive location. Oh, I'm gonna need it to be in uint64t is passive. If is passive does not equal 0, then we break, and that's how we figure out if it is passive or not. Yeah, so I'm not sure if you're talking about building the 4coder custom layer or not. But if you're talking about building a custom layer, like Ryan said, you can use build super. If you're talking about do you have to write a script or can you just use, you can just put in any command there. It doesn't have to be a build script. You can put in like cc, you can use anything you can type on the command line can go into the project command. So that means you can write a project command that says build super.bat if you're talking about combining these two different possible things you might be talking about. You can put in just a cc and then a file name, you know, whatever it is that will work for you will, if as long as it runs on the command lines, you can put it in there. It doesn't always come out exactly the same because 4coder doesn't reorder the output the way the command line does to deal with the buffering stuff. So like the command line is sometimes the only way to get a certain behavior. Like you can't, for instance, run git if git is going to ask, like you can't do a git push from 4coder because 4coder can't type the password in. That's a pretty good example of the kinds of ways where the command line is still more sophisticated than 4coder. Alright, so I want to come over here real quick. Okay, so cool. So there we go. Now let's track down, there's more stuff that won't work. Alright, so here what we want to do is we want to get rewrite view get variable app view paste index look. Oh, rewrite is separate. Where does rewrite come from? Rewrite. Interesting, interesting. So, I'm not totally sure about this, but maybe I want to think about this a little bit more. When I create a variable, there's a good chance that I'll want to create something like this. Like this right now, I want to create 3 variables. Am I going to create 3 whole variables to make this work? Or am I going to ask it to make a struct and tell it the size of the struct? How would I set individual members? Ugh. I guess I just need to make 3 separate variables. Index isn't enough. Yeah, okay. So let's go back to framework variables real quick. Okay. Hey, Doubter, how's it going? index. Set that paste index there. Oh, Dowder asks, what have I been working on at Rad Game Tools? So I spent the first, until very recently, I spent the first about, what has it been, 4 months, 4.5 months, well, not quite 4.5 months yet. I've spent working on basically, I mean, the best way to describe it is I've been working on a UI system with which I'm going to build a few things. The first, I've actually built one thing with it, which was sort of to bootstrap up the UI system to get it working, which was just that Rad has, you know, a lot of employees, and they do a lot of business with a lot of different people, with, you know, which ends up involving sensitive information about, like, in development things that are under NDA for different consoles and like stuff like that. And so they want to not keep their emails on their primary network all the time, where that information could eventually be vulnerable to a leak or something. And so for protection, they take that off the primary network, but they still need to refer to it sometimes. So I made a mail viewer system that makes it easy for them to like basically pre-process all of their mail data and extract out things like attachments and metadata on the emails so that they can easily go look things up, but they don't have to have like a mail viewer that usually basically it's a mail viewer that works without being connected to the internet, without the assumption that it's going to be used to like send and receive new messages. It's just a viewer for the old backlog of the inbox that they've retired off the primary network. And it's set up so that they don't have to. They used to have to like wait for about 30 minutes whenever they would try to access that, because of the fact that the mail clients aren't set up to work that way. So that's the first thing I did. This is the first thing I did, was just to work up a new UI system that I could use, and I built that thing with it. And then now I've done a couple of more upgrades to the UI system, and I'm starting to work on like table widgets and docking windows and like something similar to like 4coder's buffer rendering stuff. Not really similar in the sense, I shouldn't say similar to 4coder's buffer rendering thing, but in the same way that 4coder has to render a full text file and do syntax highlighting and stuff like that, the thing I'm working on at Rad will do the same thing. And that's all to basically build up various pieces that will be useful to put together a debugger front end at some point in the future. Basically, the mail clients can do it. The problem is that they take a long time to switch between the mail clients fail. They like throw up on the many gigabytes of data that it takes, that they have sitting around from. You have to remember, this is like 20 years worth of data for many employees that are all doing their own separate inboxes that they're managing. So we're not talking about just a little bit of data, and those mail clients end up doing just a ton of work to like index and prepare that backlog to be viewed in such a way that it takes much longer than it actually has to. But the way mine works is it does a pre-processing phase that takes about 5 minutes to take about, what is it, like, I think if I remember the sizes correctly, it was like 16 gigabytes. In 5 minutes, it can do a pre-process phase, and the pre-process drastically reduces the amount of data it takes to actually store the archive, because it's only looking for key things rather than keeping the original data there and adding an index on top. It's basically stripping lots of stuff down, so it could drop from 16 down to like 10 gigabytes to store all of the extensions and mail and messages and stuff. And then once that's been done once, the mail viewers are just immediate. And yeah, so the short story, or I guess the conclusion is, I've been working on a UI system so far. Eventually, all of the tools I build up in that UI system will go to work in various different things. The primary thing I will be working on using this UI system pretty soon is the debugger front end. Get variable, set variable, set variable, set variable. Paste, view set variable, view get variable. There we go. Okay, I have a couple questions here. Yes, the BMXer, that's totally possible. I'm not saying I will do it, but I will keep that in mind, because I've had a couple times when I felt like something like that would make sense, so who knows, that might happen. Did I explore PIM GUI? No, I didn't. Basically, Jeff and I talked about it, and we both agreed that it would be better off to just build something from scratch for our particular use, rather than getting involved in a UI library. Yeah, he just said that he was totally fine with me building one from scratch, and that it was probably what he'd prefer, in fact, which is what I preferred as well, so that's what happened. Out of curiosity, is the UI immediate mode? Yeah. Actually wondering if the 4coder UI is immediate mode as well. The 4coder UI is... I mean, the 4coder UI is hardly a UI system. It's not really worth categorizing, because it doesn't... like, this shit here... It's kind of set up to be immediate mode, but it's not got any of the advantages of immediate mode. Like, this is like just barely holding together. It doesn't normally with immediate mode, the whole point is supposed to be that it's easy to create new widgets and stuff, and this is even harder to create new widgets in than any other system I've ever used. And it also isn't very easy to edit the UI. Like, it just the thing you're supposed to get, the ability to easily do creative and sweeping changes with your UI quickly without breaking things. You don't get any of that. It also doesn't have any of the like things that other people talk about, like being able to be highly optimized for redraw. It doesn't have it. The 4coder UI system is just a mess. I had no idea what I was doing. Basically, the way oh, I didn't know PIM GUI wasn't a library. I assumed it was. Um, yeah, I don't know what that means. Partitioned immediate mode graphical user interface. I don't know. I've never heard of that. It might be that. Mine basically is split up into discrete phases that do separate things. There's a layout phase in which the user code generates a data structure that describes the layout of the UI. There's a consume input phase that takes in the input and um, does operations based on how that input combines with how the layout happens. So like if the mouse gets pressed down, then it takes the point of the mouse and queries the layout data and finds out if there's an interacting item that it needs to interact with. And then if there is, it does whatever it needs to do, which might involve calling a callback that was put into the layout data, and it'll call that callback and do some update to the state of the program. And after updating the state, that callback can return true, which says now we need to do a new layout before we consume any more input. And so then the update loop ends and it goes back to a layout and does a layout pass and has a new layout structure before it continues consuming input. And then once it's done consuming all of the input that it has, it'll do one single render from the current layout that it has. So basically the phases are do a layout, consume input. If during consuming input the layout changes, do a new layout, and then consume input, and do layout, consume input. Continue this loop until there's no more input to consume. At the end, render whatever layout you have, and then sleep until more input occurs. And then when new input occurs, you don't do the layout right away because you still have the layout from last time. So you start doing update from then on. You start with update and only do a new layout ever if the update phase returns true and says we need to do a new layout because of this input. So this works out pretty well, and it means that you're minimizing the amount of layout work you do. It means that no matter what order or no matter how quickly or slowly input comes in, there's always this rule that after an input phase, you go back to doing a layout if you need to, so that if all of the inputs come in one frame, or if they get spread out over 60 frames, the same number of relayouts will always happen, so that you always get the same behavior. You don't get weird things where, because something happened, this happens in 4coder a lot, if you type quickly enough, it can miss keys because it doesn't, like for instance, if I type something in here, and then I press enter and type another character quickly enough, I can get it so that even though I press enter and then 4, you'll see that the 4 showed up in the file name and not on the buffer. And that's because if they come into the same frame, even though the enter happened before the 4, it processes them both in a group in a way that doesn't cause the new state to be applied before it consumes the next character, if that makes sense. It just consumes all of the characters and then updates this, and then like finds out the UI state, whereas the one I made it rad always does the right thing no matter what happens there. Yeah, so that's the basic structure of it. I've done a lot more with it than just all that. I now have the ability to make your own widgets as a user without having to edit the core at all, using a little scripting thing I set up. Basically, the scripts let you generate all of the C++ code that defines how the data for a widget gets laid out in the data structure, and it defines the basic interaction modes that it has, and then you as the user define in C code how you render it, and then you attach callbacks to it to give it its meaning. So, yeah, it's kind of it works pretty well, I think. Alright, so getting back to work. Boop 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 boop. Here we go, that's what I was expecting. In 32T. Next rewrite. So this is a view set variable app view next rewrite lock 0 view set variable next rewrite uint64t next rewrite equals 0 view get variable next rewrite done. Okay. Boop, boop, boop. Okay, so there we go. I've reconfigured everything now, I think, to use the new system. I just haven't implemented a new system. We've just been assuming that I could make all of these calls work. So, let's go and make that happen. API implementation, view set setting. Why don't we do this, actually? I want to see... Open view, close view, set active view, view get setting, view set setting, view set split proportion, compute cursor, set scroll, set mark, set highlight, set buffer, post fade, get user inputs. There we go. That's where I'm going to put it. Alright, so the different things we need to implement include create view variable, application links. How exactly should I be passing that string there? I guess a null terminated name will be fine. Default value. Yeah, I see what you're talking about. I don't really like any of the like if you go back and look at the original I Am GUI video that Casey did, and then a lot of the different things I've heard people talk about, like there's the one frame of lag approach to getting a lot of things done, and basically all of this comes from always writing the code as if do this thing, then result. Like if widget, then here's the result. And I don't like that setup at all. I don't do it that way. I do it as widget, and that it's like putter equals widget, and then I create a local callback, like callbackable thing, and then set then like finish event handler putter and then my callback. And the advantage of doing it this way is that you don't have to do the response to the widget the moment that you lay the widget out. My system completely separates out the layout from the update, so that the entire layout happens before any updating happens. And that's super important if you want to avoid weird things happening, like what I was just reading just now when you linked to that. If you allow for, you can click on a button and then that changes how the next thing gets laid out, then that means at the beginning you have a certain state. During your layout, the state can change, and you are hoping that you have a coherent state all the way through that never gets you into a state where you have rendered part of your layout as if you had one state and the rest of your layout as if you had another state. And so you have this weird one frame where your state is wrong for half of the layout and right for the other half. And then the next frame it all gets fixed, and that is just like scroll bars are a perfect example of things that I find very hard to get right when you just rely on one frame of lag to carry the information over from what just happened to what happens next to deal with this problem of state update. And you still have to update the state in the middle of a layout. You're just updating the state in the middle of a layout with one frame of lag. So I abandon the idea of if button then result, and instead I do button with callback for what happens when this button gets clicked. It's still immediate mode in the sense that I don't say create button and set button position. I do button and I give a callback to the do button, and it's understood that that none of the effects of my widgets occur until the update phase, so that the entire layout can happen correctly without having to worry about how the updates that are happening to the state will affect that layout being correct. Okay, so there's that one. View set variable. Get variable. So Doubter asks, couldn't you just do everything the straightforward I Am GUI way, but with it skipping the drawing part, and in the end just have the drawing part? No. No, because you still are assuming that you don't have more than one input to deal with at any given time. But what happens if you have a frame that has you are currently clicking and holding down and a key gets pressed? And how do you decide which handlers handle those events depending on the order they come in? Well, if the drag changes the state of the program in such a way that the event handler for the key gets changed and the key comes later, but it got processed first because you are processing. Because say you do you say here are the event handlers for keys, and then you do your actual things that need to be rendered in a separate after, then now when the key is pressed second, its event handler goes first, and so it can affect the state before the drag happens, and vice versa. You could have the same problem going the other way. There's no way to keep the order of the events correct when the way you decide when to do a response to an event is constrained by the order in which you specify your handlers, right? So you have 10 event types and 10 handlers. You don't want the order in which you handle events to be specified by the order in which you handle, the order in which you laid out your handlers, right? Here are 10 handlers, and I say, first event handler A, event handler B, event handler C, and so on. If I get in a situation where I get event B and then event A, I don't want event A to be handled first. And there's no way to make that always correct if you are relying on this code path to be the code path that both specifies the handlers and acts upon them. Yeah, and it turns out that the callbacks are just fine in this case. I know that callbacks can be a red flag, but this is exactly the right place to use them. It's the exact same semantic idea that you have when you do the if this thing then block, except that instead of writing if, you're just writing a callback body, and you have to remember in your head that that callback body can only be called from a certain scoped portion of runtime, which is during the update phase. But then you get the nice guarantee that events happen in the order that you conceptually think of them as happening, and that's better than pretending that it's not the same semantic idea when you're doing it inside of an if block. You're still conditionally doing the thing. It's just that what you really wanted to say all along was, here's the result I would like to have attached to this button. And you want the proximity of the code that lays the button out and the code that responds to the button to be, you want them right next to each other. You want them to be very proximal. That doesn't mean you actually want them to execute at the same time. And that's the thing you could easily get yourself convinced that you do want them to happen at the same time. No one wants them to happen at the same time. It's just we want the code to be near each other because it makes it easier to organize how you think about where's the button, where's the code that lays that button out, where's the code that responds to it. It's all together because you very often change those things together. And so that's a huge benefit, whereas with a retain mode thing, you have to set up an ID and then go look for all the places where that ID occurs, because that helps you figure out, in some places where the ID occurs, you're doing the layout, and in other places where the ID occurs, you're doing the response to events. But in immediate mode, it localizes the code, but you don't actually want all of the actions of specifying your handlers, handling your events, and rendering your UI don't actually all want to happen at the same time. They want to be separate, distinct phases. And so callbacks are the way to get the proximity correct so that you can do immediate mode without having to also have proximity in time that you don't want. Yeah, and the other reason that I would defend callbacks in this case is that unlike often when you're setting a callback, there's basically two different ways that you can imagine callbacks existing. Or let me put it another way. For any time you use a callback, the longer the lifetime of that callback, the more you should be concerned about it becoming complicated. So a callback who you pass into another procedure is the least complicated kind of callback, because as long as it's not storing, as long as you're not passing a callback into another procedure and then it stores it into global memory, if it's just using that as, here's the answer to the question, how do I open a file, and you pass it a callback, yes, that's not as good as if you just got to pass it a file. in some cases, but that's a pretty non-concerning way for a callback to work. It's a pain in the ass, but it's not concerning in deeper ways. When callbacks really become a problem is when it's things like the 4coder hook system. The 4coder hooks become the same callback for once and for all time, and they're kind of a global thing that's just there. And that's actually where it becomes problematic, because now you are participating in the long-range behavior of your thing rather than in a localized scope you have this callback that could be called. When you don't know when or why your callbacks could be called, you're in more trouble than if they're in a localized scope. So with the UI thing, for instance, they have a lifetime of, for as long as this layout is valid, this callback has to remain correct, but that's actually a smaller scope than you'd think, considering the fact that the only time that the layout becomes invalid is as soon as a state change has occurred. And so it makes actually the whole thing very predictable, for me at least. The callbacks are only stored until one of them gets called, for the most part, and then they're all flushed and you get a new one. And so for UI, it makes a mental model that's actually quite close to what you're looking for, in terms of you can predict exactly when these things are getting called and understand why they get called. They can't be called from anywhere except for an update phase, and that's perfect, actually. Later, Ryan. Alright, so we have the API all like stubbed out here. Let me see how far we are into this. An hour and 38 minutes. So this is like part 1. I'm gonna take a 5-minute break, and then we will implement these guys in part 2. So I will see you all in just a minute.